hello friends, about the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed. And I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. The first few years for the artist. The silence was deafening at first, broken only by the wind whistling through the pines and the occasional rustle of some unseen critter in the undergrowth. I guess that's what got to me the most in the beginning, the feeling of being utterly alone. My cabin wasn't much, just a two-room shack with a leaky roof and a wood-burning stove that smoked more than it heated. But it was mine, or at least it had been. I found it abandoned, half-rotted, reclaimed by the wilderness. Figured no one would miss it. I spent my days foraging for edible plants, setting snares for rabbits, and trying to patch up the holes in the roof. Nights were the worst. The darkness pressed in on me, filled with unseen eyes and imagined threats. I'd lie awake, heart pounding, every creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of fear through me. But gradually, the fear subsided, replaced by a dull ache of loneliness. I started talking to myself, just to hear a human voice. I named the squirrels that stole my nuts and the birds that sang outside my window. I even started reading aloud from the tattered books I'd salvaged from the cabin, just to fill the silence. Then, one morning, I woke to find the front door ajar. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide. But curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously pushed the door open and stepped outside. There, on the porch, was a single can of peaches. Not the kind I'd seen in years, the fancy kind with the pull-tab top. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Where had it come from? There wasn't another soul for miles around, or so I thought. A shiver ran down my spine. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. And they knew I was alone. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, like I was some animal in a zoo enclosure. Every time I went outside, I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see a figure lurking amongst the trees. Sleep was impossible. I'd lie awake, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, my imagination conjuring up all sorts of horrors. I kept replaying the discovery of that can of peaches in my mind. Was it some kind of bizarre prank? Some hiker stumbling across my place and leaving a gift? But the nearest trail was miles away, and who carries canned peaches on a hike anyway? The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an offering from some local, some weirdo mountain man who lived off the grid. Maybe they were just trying to be friendly, in their own strange way. But the primal fear gnawing at my gut told me otherwise. This wasn't friendly. This was a warning. Then came the notes. At first, they were just scraps of paper, tucked under a rock by the porch or wedged in the doorframe. Short, cryptic messages scrawled in messy handwriting. We're watching you. You can't hide. You're not alone. The messages escalated. They became more personal, more threatening. They mentioned things about me, things no stranger could possibly know. Details about my past, about my family, about the nightmares that haunted my sleep. It was like this person was inside my head, reading my thoughts, feeding off my fear. I tried to convince myself it was all a coincidence, some elaborate hoax. But the fear was a constant knot in my stomach, a cold dread that clung to me like a shadow. I knew, deep down, that this was no joke. Someone was out there, toying with me, and they were getting closer. I did what I guess any sane person would do. I called the cops. Now, I knew it was a long shot. The nearest town was a speck on the map, an hour's drive on a good day, and weird notes from a possible stalker probably wasn't topping their list of priorities. The deputy who showed up a couple days later, yeah, a couple days, urgent has a different meaning out here, was a young guy, fresh out of the academy, you could tell. He looked at my cabin like it might bite him, and when I showed him the notes, this nervous little laugh escaped him. You got some creative neighbors, he chuckled, but his eyes darted around like he expected someone to jump out from the trees. I tried to explain, really I did. About the peaches, the escalating threats, the feeling of being watched. But the words came out jumbled, frantic. I probably sounded like a raving lunatic. He gave me the whole "will keep an eye out" spiel, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He thought I was just some kook, a city boy who couldn't handle the solitude. Maybe he was right. Maybe the isolation was finally getting to me. But then he noticed the broken latch on my shed. I tried to fix it, but the wood was rotten, the screws wouldn't hold. He poked at it, frowned. "Looks like someone forced this," he said, a new edge to his voice. That got his attention. He started taking things more seriously, poking around, asking questions. But there were no footprints, no other signs of forced entry. Just those damn notes, and my increasingly shaky account of events. He left eventually, promising to patrol the area more often. But as I watched his cruiser disappear down the dirt road, a wave of despair washed over me. He wasn't going to do anything. No one was. I was on my own. And whoever was out there, they knew it. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin. It felt like a trap, every shadow holding a potential threat. So, I did something stupid. I started following him. I know. Classic horror movie mistake. But desperation makes you do dumb things. I figured if I could find out who this guy was, maybe understand what he wanted, maybe I could reason with him, or at least find a way to fight back. It wasn't hard to track him. He wasn't exactly subtle. Broken branches, footprints in the soft earth, the occasional glint of sunlight off something metallic, a knife, maybe? Or something worse. He led me deep into the woods, further than I'd ever ventured before. The terrain got rougher, the trees denser, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. I felt a prickle of unease, like I was being watched, but that was nothing new. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the distance, a flash of something dark against the green. I crouched behind a fallen log, heart pounding in my chest. He was there, all right. Taller than I expected, gaunt, with long, greasy hair that hung down his back. He was dressed in rags, his skin grimy, his eyes wild and unfocused. He looked like he hadn't bathed in months, like he belonged to the woods more than any human ever could. He was carrying something. At first, I thought it was a rifle, but as he got closer, I realized it was an axe. The blade glinted in the sunlight, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just some harmless weirdo. This was a predator. He stopped in a small clearing, his eyes scanning the trees, his nostrils twitching like he was smelling the air. He was close, too close. I could hear his ragged breathing, the rustle of his clothes. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't spot me. Then he turned his head, and our eyes met. Time seemed to freeze. Those wild eyes, filled with a chilling mix of madness and malice, bored into me. I knew in that moment that I was in serious trouble. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a fight for survival. Adrenaline surged through me. I scrambled backward, the dry leaves crunching under my weight. He yelled something, a guttural, animalistic sound, and lunged towards me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping in my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. He was right behind me. I could hear him crashing through the trees, gaining on me. I had no idea where I was going, just blindly following the downward slope of the terrain, hoping to put some distance between us. My foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling, tumbling head over heels down a small embankment. I landed with a thud, the wind knocked out of me. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for air, pain shooting through my ankle. But I couldn't stay there. He was coming. I pushed myself up, ignoring the throbbing in my ankle, and limped towards a cluster of boulders. Maybe I could hide, lose him in the rocks. I squeezed myself into a narrow crevice, the cold, damp stone pressing against my skin. I held my breath, listening for any sign of pursuit. Silence. Just the pounding of my own heart and the wind whispering through the trees. Had I lost him? I peeked out cautiously. Nothing. Maybe he'd given up. Maybe I was safe. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like metal against stone. He was close. He was searching for me. I pressed myself further back into the crevice, my eyes darting around in the dim light. There had to be another way out, another escape route. But there was nothing, just solid rock. I was trapped. The scraping sound got closer, then stopped right outside my hiding place. I could hear his breathing now, heavy and ragged. He was right there, on the other side of the rocks. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. This was it. This was how it ended. The silence stretched on, each second an eternity. I waited for the blow, for the axe to come crashing down, but nothing happened. Just the sound of his breathing, ragged and uneven, close enough that I could feel it on my skin. Then, a voice, a low, rasping whisper, "I know you're in there." My blood ran cold. He knew. He'd known all along. This whole chase, this cat and mouse game, it was all just for his amusement. He chuckled, a dry, hacking sound that echoed off the rocks. "Come on out, now. Don't make this harder than it has to be." My mind raced. What could I do? There was no escape, no way to fight back. I was trapped like a rat in a corner. "I can hear you breathing," he whispered, his voice closer now, right outside the crevice. "I can smell your fear." He started to hum a tuneless melody, a low, droning sound that grated on my nerves. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, trying to disappear into the rock. Then, a scraping sound again, but this time it was further away. He was moving. Was he leaving? I held my breath, listening intently. The humming faded, replaced by the sounds of the forest, the wind rustling through the leaves, the chirping of birds. He was gone. Cautiously, I peered out from my hiding place. The clearing was empty. He'd vanished. Relief washed over me, followed by a wave of exhaustion. I stumbled out of the crevice, my legs shaky, my body trembling. I needed to get out of there, back to the cabin, back to some semblance of safety. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the ground. A small, white object, half hidden in the undergrowth. I picked it up. It was a piece of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it slowly, my heart sinking as I recognized the familiar scrawled handwriting. "This isn't over," it read. "I'll be seeing you soon." I limped back to the cabin, the note clutched in my hand like a talisman. My ankle throbbed with every step, a constant reminder of my close call. The woods seemed different now, menacing, full of unseen eyes. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. I barricaded the door, boarded up the windows, but it did little to ease my fear. He'd been inside before, he could get in again. It was only a matter of time. I tried to make sense of it all. Who was this guy? What did he want? Why was he tormenting me? The questions swirled in my head, unanswered, fueling my anxiety. I thought about the note, the chilling message scrawled in that messy handwriting. "I'll be seeing you soon." It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Days turned into nights, each one a terrifying ordeal. I barely slept, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside the window sending my heart racing. I jumped at shadows, my nerves frayed, my mind on the brink of collapse. I started seeing things, hearing things. Whispers in the wind, footsteps outside the door, the glint of eyes in the darkness. Was I going crazy? Or was he really out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike? Then, one night, I heard it. A distinct sound, a metallic clang, like something heavy being dropped. It came from the shed. He was back. I grabbed the axe I'd found buried behind the cabin, more for comfort than actual defense, let's be honest, and crept towards the shed. Each step felt like walking on eggshells, the silence amplifying every rustle and creak. Moonlight filtered through the gaps in the wooden planks, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with my every move. I reached the shed door, my hand hovering over the rusty latch. It was already broken, hanging open at an unnatural angle. He'd been here, all right. But why the shed? What was he after? Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark, the musty smell of old wood and damp earth filling my nostrils. I fumbled for my lighter, the flame flickering to life, casting a dim glow across the cluttered space. Tools hung haphazardly on the walls, cobwebs draped across forgotten boxes, and a rusted wheelbarrow sat overturned in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing to indicate what he'd been doing in here. Then I saw it. A glint of metal in the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of firewood. I cautiously approached, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I recognized the shape, a rifle. A hunting rifle, with a scope and a long, menacing barrel. He was arming himself. This wasn't just about scaring me anymore. This was something else, something far more sinister. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching for the axe. I had to get out of there, warn someone, call the police. But as I turned to leave, I heard a noise from outside. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the shed. He was back. Panic seized me. I was trapped, cornered like an animal. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps stopped just outside the shed. I could hear him breathing, heavy and ragged, just like before. He was toying with me, savoring the moment, letting the fear build. Then, a voice, low and menacing, cut through the silence. I told you I'd be seeing you. He stepped into the doorway, the moonlight framing his silhouette. He was holding the rifle, the barrel glinting ominously in the dim light. My eyes darted to the axe in my hand, but I knew it was no match for a gun. Don't, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but with an underlying steel that sent shivers down my spine. Just don't. He raised the rifle, aiming it at my chest. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, I heard a click, the metallic sound of the hammer falling on an empty chamber. He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the shed. Did you really think it would be that easy? He sneered. No, no, no. We have so much more to do. He lowered the rifle, but kept it trained on me. We need to talk, he said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow even more terrifying than his threats. We need to understand each other. He stepped closer, the rifle still pointed at me. I could smell him now, a foul odor of sweat and dirt and something else, something wild and untamed. Come on, he said, gesturing towards the door with the rifle. Let's go for a walk. I had no choice. I followed him out of the shed, the axe feeling heavy and useless in my hand. He kept the rifle trained on me, his finger on the trigger. We walked in silence, the only sound the crunching of leaves under our feet and the chirping of crickets in the night. He led me deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, away from any chance of help. I didn't know where he was taking me, or what he planned to do, but I knew one thing, this was just the beginning of my nightmare. He led me to a clearing, a small, desolate patch of land surrounded by towering pines. In the center, a campfire crackled, casting an eerie orange glow on his face. He gestured towards a fallen log, and I sat down, my body stiff with fear. He settled opposite me, the rifle resting across his knees. The firelight danced in his eyes, and I could see a glint of madness there, a flicker of something dark and dangerous. I've been watching you, he began, his voice low and gravelly. For a long time. He spoke about my routines, my habits, the little things that made up my solitary existence. He knew when I woke up, when I went to sleep, when I ventured out to gather firewood. He knew me better than I knew myself. He spoke about his own life, about the events that led him to this isolated wilderness. He spoke of betrayal, of loss, of a world that had turned its back on him. He spoke of his anger, his resentment, his desire for revenge. He spoke for hours, his words a rambling, incoherent mix of paranoia and delusion. I listened, nodding occasionally, afraid to interrupt, afraid to provoke him. As the night wore on, the fire died down, the flames dwindling to embers. The darkness crept in, closing around us like a shroud. I felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the realization that I was trapped with a madman, miles from civilization, with no hope of escape. He leaned closer, his eyes burning into mine. You understand, don't you? He whispered. You understand why I have to do this. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, choked by fear. He stood up, the rifle in his hand. It's time, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. He raised the rifle, aiming it at my head. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But the shot never came. Instead, I heard a rustle in the bushes, a snapping twig. He turned his head, his eyes searching the darkness. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a dark shape against the night sky. Another man, taller, broader, with a shotgun in his hands. The deputy. He'd come back. There was a shout, a struggle, the sound of gunfire echoing through the trees. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The fire had died down, leaving only a pile of smoldering ashes. The deputy was gone, and so was the madman. I was alone. I never knew what happened that night, how the deputy found me, what became of the man who had terrorized me for so long. But I knew one thing, I would never be the same. The woods, once a sanctuary, now held a darkness that I could never escape. The silence was no longer peaceful, but filled with the echoes of his voice, his threats, his laughter. And in the shadows, I could still see his eyes, watching me, waiting. I've spent my whole life in Arizona, and let me tell you, it gets under your skin. Not in some mystical, woo way, but just the bigness of it. The way the desert stretches on forever, the heat baking the ground so hard it feels like concrete. Growing up, I was always outside, hiking, messing around in my dad's old Jeep, camping out with my buddies. We thought we were so tough, conquering the wilderness. Truth is, the desert always has the upper hand. It's not like I didn't like it. There's something about that emptiness, the silence that's so profound it almost rings in your ears. You feel small, insignificant, but also kind of free. No one to tell you what to do, no rules except the ones nature sets. But even when I was a kid, I'd get this prickling on the back of my neck sometimes. Like something was watching me from behind those saguaro cacti, those weird rock formations that look like melted faces in the sunset. Most people think the desert's just sand and dust, but it ain't that simple. There's canyons that drop off so steep, you could fall and no one would find your body for years. Dry riverbeds that turn into raging torrents if you're unlucky enough to get caught in a flash flood. And the animals, rattlesnakes, scorpions, mountain lions. Things that can kill you quick, without a second thought. So yeah, I guess you could say I had a healthy respect for the desert. But I never really felt scared of it, not until the weekend trip down south. That's when things started to get different. So, this particular weekend, I was itching to get away from it all. My girlfriend and I had this massive fight, the kind where you say things you don't mean and slam doors. I needed space, needed to clear my head, and there's no better place for that than the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my camping gear, a cooler full of beer and jerky, and told my roommate I was heading out. He gave me that look he always does, like I'm some kind of weirdo for liking the desert so much. Whatever, more peace and quiet for me. I had this vague idea of heading south, towards the Mexican border. There's tons of dirt roads down there, barely even on the map. I figured I'd just drive till I found a spot that looked good, set up camp, and maybe do some exploring. After a few hours on the highway, I turned off onto this dusty track that looked promising. The Jeep rattled and bounced like crazy, but that's half the fun, right? Windows down, sun beating down, classic rock blasting on the radio. I felt that tension from the fight draining away with every mile. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when I finally spotted it, a narrow trail leading up the main track, barely visible in the fading light. No signs, no markers, just two tire ruts disappearing into the scrub. This was exactly what I was looking for. I followed the trail for maybe a mile, the Jeep complaining the whole way. The desert was changing, getting more rugged. Jagged rock formations rose up on either side, casting long shadows. The air felt thicker, heavier somehow. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, with something dark and squat in the middle. As I got closer, I realized it was an old mine shaft, the entrance half collapsed. A rusty metal sign hung crookedly above it, the words too faded to read. Now, I'm not usually one for trespassing, but something about that mine pulled me in. Maybe it was the sense of history, the thought of those old-timers digging for gold or whatever. Or maybe it was just plain curiosity. Either way, I parked the Jeep, grabbed my flashlight, and headed towards the shaft. Even before I got close, I could feel a change in the air. It was colder down there, and the silence was different. Deeper, somehow. Like the whole desert was holding its breath. I shone my flashlight into the entrance, the beam swallowed by the darkness. I could hear the skittering of something inside, probably just rats, I told myself. But still, that prickling feeling on the back of my neck was back, stronger than ever. I took a deep breath and stepped into the shaft. I squeezed through the entrance of the mine shaft, feeling a wave of cool, damp air wash over me. It was a welcome relief from the desert heat, but it also carried this musty smell. Not just dirt and rocks, but something almost metallic, like old blood. Yeah, I know, that sounds dramatic, but that's what it smelled like. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough-hewn walls of the shaft. It was narrow, barely wider than my shoulders, and the ceiling was low enough that I had to duck in places. The ground was uneven, covered in loose rocks and debris. I could hear the scuttling of rats or something down in the darkness, and I tried not to think about what else might be lurking down there. I kept moving forward, telling myself it was just an old mine, nothing to be afraid of. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air got thicker, harder to breathe, and that metallic smell grew stronger. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the depths of the mine. I shone my flashlight down a side tunnel, but it just seemed to go on forever. I thought about turning back, but something kept me going. Maybe it was just stubbornness, or maybe it was something else, something pulling me deeper into the darkness. Then I saw it, a faint light up ahead. It wasn't much, just a glimmer, but it was enough to give me a jolt of hope. Maybe there was another way out, or maybe I'd find something interesting down there. Whatever it was better than standing around in the dark. I picked up my pace, eager to reach the source of the light. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from a small opening in the rock face, barely big enough to squeeze through. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should risk it. But the curiosity was too strong. I took a deep breath and crawled through the opening. On the other side, I found myself in a small chamber. The light was brighter here, and I could see that it was coming from a crack in the ceiling. The chamber was damp and cold, and the air was even thicker than in the shaft. But there was something else here, something that made my skin crawl. It was a feeling of being watched. Like there was something else in the chamber with me, something unseen, something malevolent. I shone my flashlight around, but I couldn't see anything. Just the bare rock walls and the damp floor. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every passing second. I knew I had to get out of there. I turned to go back through the opening, but as I did, I heard a sound behind me. A soft, scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly turned back, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. And that's when I saw it. My flashlight beam landed on it, a pair of eyes. Not animal eyes, no way. These were human eyes, reflecting the light back at me with this knowing glint. They were set in a face that was pale and gaunt, almost skeletal, with a wildness in them that made my blood run cold. For a split second, we just stared at each other, frozen. Then the figure let out a low growl, this guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the whole chamber. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose rock and falling on my ass. The flashlight clattered away, plunging me into near darkness. I scrambled for the light, my hand shaking so bad I could barely grip it. When I finally got it back on, the figure was gone. Vanished. Like it had never been there at all. I was breathing hard, my heart pounding like a drum. I told myself it was just some crazy homeless guy seeking shelter in the mine. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. There was something off about those eyes, something inhuman. I wanted to get out of there, right then and there. But the way back through the opening was blocked by a pile of rocks that hadn't been there before. I tried to move them, but they were too heavy, wedged in tight. I was trapped. Panic started to set in. I yelled for help, but my voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the darkness. I kicked at the rocks, but it was no use. I was stuck in that chamber with whatever the hell that thing was. Then I remembered the light coming from the crack in the ceiling. Maybe there was a way out up there. I looked up, but the crack was too high, the walls too smooth to climb. There was no way I could reach it. Unless... I looked around the chamber, searching for something to help me. My eyes landed on a rusty old pickaxe, leaning against the wall. It was heavy, but it might just work. I grabbed it and started hacking at the wall beneath the crack, chipping away at the rock. It was slow going, the pickaxe heavy and awkward in my hands. Dust and debris rained down on me, making it hard to breathe. But I kept at it, driven by fear and desperation. After what felt like hours, I finally made a foothold. I jammed the pickaxe into the crack, using it as a lever to pull myself up. The rock crumbled beneath my weight, but I managed to get a handhold on the edge of the crack. I pulled myself up, scraping my skin on the rough rock. I squeezed through the crack, emerging into another chamber. This one was bigger, with a high ceiling and a narrow passage leading off into the darkness. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the pickaxe and ran, not stopping until I was back in the main shaft. I didn't look back, just kept running until I saw the faint glimmer of daylight from the entrance. I stumbled out into the open air, gasping for breath. The desert sun had never felt so good. I didn't go back for my jeep that night. I just kept walking, following the trail back to the main road. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, miles away. I called a tow truck for the jeep, and then I called my roommate to come pick me up. I never told him what happened in the mine. I don't think he'd believe me anyway. But I know what I saw. And I know I'll never go back to that part of the desert again. I stumbled out of the mine shaft, blinking in the harsh sunlight. The desert air felt hot and dry against my skin, and I could taste the dust in my mouth. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. But the image of that face, those eyes, kept flashing through my mind. I looked around for my jeep, but it was nowhere in sight. I must have wandered farther than I thought in the dark. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but the screen was blank. No signal. Of course. Out here in the middle of nowhere, there was never any damn signal. I cursed under my breath, feeling a wave of despair wash over me. I was lost, alone, and miles from civilization. And to top it off, I was probably going to die of dehydration. I started walking, following the tire tracks back the way I came. The sun beat down on me mercilessly, and the heat shimmered off the desert floor. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, soaking through my shirt. My throat was parched, and my head was pounding. I walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape remained the same. Endless stretches of sand and rock, dotted with the occasional cactus. No sign of civilization, no sign of help. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I spotted something in the distance. A flicker of movement, a flash of color. I squinted, trying to make it out. It looked like a car. I picked up my pace, my heart filled with hope. As I got closer, I could see it was a beat-up pickup truck, parked on the side of the road. There was a man standing next to it, tinkering under the hood. I stumbled towards him, waving my arms. He looked up, startled, and then his face broke into a grin. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Looks like we got ourselves a visitor." He was an older guy, with a weathered face and a shock of white hair. He wore a faded denim shirt and a pair of dusty work boots. He looked like he'd spent his whole life in the desert. "I'm lost," I said, my voice hoarse. "Can you help me?" "Lost, are you?" he chuckled. "Well, You've come to the right place. Name's Hank. Hop in. I'll give you a ride back to town. I thanked him profusely and climbed into the truck. The interior was hot and smelled of engine oil, but I didn't care. I was just grateful to be out of the sun and on my way to safety. As we drove, Hank chatted about the desert, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about his life. He seemed like a friendly guy, a real desert rat. But there was something about his eyes that made me uneasy. They were deep-set and dark, and they seemed to hold a hint of something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We drove for a while, and then Hank turned onto a dirt road. This is a shortcut, he explained. Saves us a good hour's drive. I nodded, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that was growing in my gut. The road was rough and bumpy, and the truck bounced around like a rodeo bull. I gripped the dashboard, my knuckles white. We drove for another mile or so, and then the truck suddenly lurched to a stop. I looked up, startled. Hank was staring out the windshield, his face pale. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. He just kept staring, his eyes wide with fear. I followed his gaze, and my blood ran cold. Standing in the middle of the road, blocking our way, was the figure from the mine. The same gaunt face, the same wild eyes. But this time, it was holding something in its hand. A pickaxe. Time seemed to slow down. The figure in the road, the pickaxe glinting in the sun, Hank's terrified face beside me. It was like a scene from a nightmare. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body was frozen in place. Then, the figure moved. It took a step towards us, raising the pickaxe above its head. The sunlight glinted off the sharp blade, and I knew we were in serious trouble. "Drive!" I yelled at Hank, my voice cracking. "Get us out of here." Hank seemed to snap out of his trance. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward. The figure leaped out of the way just in time, the pickaxe whistling past the hood. We sped down the dirt road, the truck bouncing violently over the rough terrain. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching us go. It didn't chase us, but its presence lingered, a chilling reminder of the danger we had just escaped. Hank was driving like a madman, his face grim. I could feel the tension radiating off him, the fear that still gripped him. I didn't blame him. I was terrified too. "Who was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Hank shook his head, his eyes fixed on the road. "I don't know," he muttered. "But I've seen him before. Out here in the desert. He's not right." I didn't press him for details. I had a feeling I didn't want to know. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the roar of the engine and the rattle of the truck. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. The landscape seemed to grow more ominous as the light faded. Finally, we reached the main road. Hank slowed down, and I let out a sigh of relief. We were almost back to civilization. "Thanks for the ride, Hank," I said. "I owe you one." He nodded, his face still pale. "Just be careful out there," he said. "The desert can be a dangerous place." I got out of the truck and watched as it drove away. I stood there for a moment, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of the town. The traffic, the streetlights, the chatter of people. It felt good to be back in the world of the living. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That the figure from the mine, the man with the pickaxe, was still out there somewhere, lurking in the shadows. And I knew that I would never be truly safe, not as long as he was out there. I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread. Even back in my own apartment, with the familiar sounds of the city around me, I felt like I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. Every creak in the building sent shivers down my spine. Sleep was impossible. I tossed and turned in bed. The image of that gaunt face burned into my mind. I kept replaying the encounter in the mine, the near miss with the pickaxe, the terror in Hank's eyes. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had stumbled into something dark and dangerous, something that wasn't meant to be found. The next day, I tried to go about my normal routine, but it was no use. I couldn't concentrate at work, my mind constantly drifting back to the desert. I jumped at every sudden noise, every unexpected touch. My coworkers noticed my distracted state, and I mumbled something about a bad dream. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. Who would believe me anyway? I tried to distract myself, going to the gym, watching movies, even going out with friends. But nothing worked. The fear was always there, lurking beneath the surface. I felt like I was living on borrowed time, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know who that figure was, what he wanted. I started researching online, looking for any information about strange encounters in the Arizona desert. I found a few websites dedicated to unexplained phenomena, and I spent hours reading through accounts of UFO sightings, ghost stories, and other weird tales. But nothing matched what I had experienced. Then, I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to missing persons cases in Arizona. I started scrolling through the posts, and my heart sank. There were dozens of cases, people who had vanished without a trace in the vast wilderness. Many of them were hikers, campers, or off-road enthusiasts, just like me. As I read through the descriptions, a chilling thought occurred to me. Many of the missing people were last seen in areas not far from where I had encountered the figure. And some of the descriptions mentioned a strange man, a loner, who lived in the desert. A man who was sometimes seen carrying a pickaxe. Could it be the same person? Was this figure responsible for the disappearances? The thought sent a wave of fear through me. I had to do something. I had to warn someone. But who would listen? The police? they would probably just dismiss me as a crackpot. My friends, they would think I was losing it. I felt trapped, caught in a web of fear and uncertainty. I didn't know who to turn to or what to do. I was alone, facing a threat I didn't understand. And the worst part was, I knew it was only a matter of time before he found me again. The feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't just a vague sense anymore. It was like eyes were constantly on me, following my every move. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in a dark alley, a shadow that seemed to linger too long. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there, but the feeling persisted. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. I scanned the faces in the crowd, looking for any sign of recognition, any hint of that gaunt face. I avoided deserted streets and dark corners, sticking to well-lit areas even if it meant taking a longer route. I felt like a haunted animal, constantly on edge, waiting for the predator to strike. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I kept the blinds drawn, the doors locked, and the lights on even during the day. I imagined him out there, lurking in the shadows, watching me through the windows. I started checking the locks obsessively, making sure every window was secured. I even bought a baseball bat, keeping it by my bed for protection. The lack of sleep was taking its toll. I was exhausted, irritable, and constantly on edge. My work performance suffered, and my boss called me in for a talk. I mumbled something about personal problems, hoping he wouldn't press for details. I couldn't afford to lose my job, not now. One evening, I was walking home from work when I noticed a car following me. It was a beat-up pickup truck, the same one Hank had been driving. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a coincidence, but the truck kept pace with me, staying a few car lengths behind. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The truck accelerated too, keeping pace with me. I turned a corner, hoping to lose it, but the truck followed. I was starting to panic. I broke into a run, my briefcase banging against my leg. The truck accelerated, closing the distance. I could hear the engine roaring, the tires squealing as it turned the corner. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw the driver. It was him. The gaunt face, the wild eyes. He was grinning, and I could see the glint of the pickaxe in his hand. I ran for my life, dodging through the crowd, weaving in and out of traffic. The truck followed, its horn blaring. People shouted and jumped out of the way. I could hear the truck gaining on me, the roar of the engine getting louder. I turned another corner, desperate to escape. I saw an alleyway and darted into it, hoping to lose him in the maze of narrow passages. But the truck followed, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The truck screeched to a halt, blocking the alleyway. The driver's door flew open, and he stepped out. He was holding the pickaxe, and his eyes were burning with a murderous rage. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this was it. This was the end. He raised the pickaxe above his head, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the blow. But it never came. I opened my eyes and saw him standing there, frozen. His face was contorted in a mask of fear, and his eyes were fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. Standing there, in the mouth of the alleyway, was another figure. It was tall and imposing, its face hidden in the shadows. But I could see its eyes, glowing with an eerie light. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was something far more dangerous than the man with the pickaxe. The air crackled with tension. The man with the pickaxe, who had been so menacing just moments before, was now cowering like a whipped dog. His eyes darted between me and the newcomer, his face a mask of terror. It was clear that whatever was standing behind me was far more dangerous than him. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, its features obscured by the shadows of the alley. But I could see its eyes, glowing with an unnatural intensity. They were cold, predatory eyes, filled with a malice that made my blood run cold. The figure took a step forward, and the man with the pickaxe whimpered. He scrambled back, tripping over his own feet, and fell to the ground. He crawled away, whimpering and begging for mercy. The figure ignored him, its attention focused on me. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, a primal fear that I had never experienced before. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was the end. The figure spoke, its voice a low growl that seemed to reverberate through the alley. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. "This is not your place." I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I could only stare at the figure, my mind reeling. The figure took another step forward, and I could see its face more clearly now. It was a man, but there was something off about him. His features were distorted, almost grotesque, and his skin was pale and clammy. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his mouth was twisted into a cruel smile. He raised his hand, and I flinched, expecting a blow. But instead, he reached out and touched my face. His fingers were cold and clammy, like the touch of death. "You have seen too much," he said. "Now, you must pay the price." He tightened his grip on my face, his fingers digging into my skin. I cried out in pain, but he didn't relent. He was crushing my skull, squeezing the life out of me. I struggled, trying to break free, but his grip was too strong. My vision blurred, and I could feel myself losing consciousness. Just when I thought I was about to black out, I heard a sound. A high-pitched whine, like the sound of a power tool. The figure froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He turned his head, looking towards the source of the sound. I took advantage of his distraction. I gathered all my strength and headbutted him. He stumbled back, releasing his grip on my face. I gasped for air, my vision clearing. I saw the figure standing there, his face contorted in pain. He raised his hand to his head, and I saw blood trickling down his fingers. The high-pitched whine grew louder, and I saw a spark fly from the figure's hand. He screamed in pain, and his body began to convulse. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Then, with a final scream, he collapsed to the ground. I stared at him, my mind reeling. What had just happened? The high-pitched whine stopped, and I turned to see a man standing in the mouth of the alleyway. He was holding a strange device in his hand, a small, handheld device that was emitting a faint blue light. He looked at me and smiled. "You're safe now," he said. "He can't hurt you anymore." I looked at the figure on the ground, his body still twitching. I looked at the man with the device, his face calm and reassuring. And I knew, with a certainty that filled me with relief, that I was finally free. The man with the device introduced himself as Agent Miller, some kind of federal agent investigating. Well, he didn't exactly say what he was investigating. He was tight-lipped about the whole thing, but he made it clear that the man with the pickaxe and the other guy, the one who just disintegrated, were part of something bigger. Something dangerous. He asked me a bunch of questions about what I'd seen in the mine, about the symbols on the locket, which, by the way, I never found after dropping it. He seemed particularly interested in the mournful cry I'd mentioned. He even had a recording of it on his phone, and played it for me. It sent chills down my spine all over again. Agent Miller told me to forget about the whole thing, said it was handled and I was safe now. Yeah, right. Easy for him to say. He's the one with the weird tech and the government backup. Me, I'm just some dude who stumbled into something way over his head. I tried to go back to normal life, but it wasn't that simple. I kept seeing those faces in crowds, hearing that cry in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something was out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. I started carrying a knife, just a small pocket knife, but it made me feel a little safer. I also started paying more attention to the news, looking for any reports of strange happenings in the desert. There was nothing, of course. Agent Miller had been right about one thing: this stuff stayed hidden. One day, I was going through some old boxes in my closet when I found a map. It was a map of Arizona, with a bunch of markings on it. I recognized some of them, places I'd been hiking and camping over the years. But there were other markings too, in places I'd never been. And then I saw it, a small, circled area in the southern part of the state, with the words mine shaft scrawled next to it. It was the mine. The one where it all started. I stared at the map, my heart pounding in my chest. Where had I gotten this map? I didn't remember buying it, or even seeing it before. And who had made those markings? Suddenly, it all clicked. Hank. He must have slipped the map into my pocket when he gave me that ride. But why? What was he trying to tell me? I looked closer at the markings and saw that they formed a pattern. A pattern that led somewhere. Somewhere in the heart of the desert. I felt a pull, a sense of urgency. I had to go back. I had to find out what was going on. I packed my bag, grabbed my knife, and headed out the door. The desert was calling, and this time I was going to answer. Okay, so picture this. It's pitch black, the only light coming from this crappy moon hanging overhead. Albert and I are trudging along these old train tracks, the gravel crunching under our boots. The air is thick, you know, that heavy kind you get after it rains, and there's this weird metallic smell that I can't quite place. Earlier that night, we were chilling by the campfire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories, when we heard this scream. It wasn't like any scream I'd ever heard before. It was raw, desperate, like someone was being, murdered. It came from the direction of the train tracks, maybe half a mile from our campsite. Albert, being the fearless one, was all for checking it out right away. Me? I was terrified, but I wasn't about to let him go alone. So, we grabbed our flashlights and headed out into the darkness. The tracks were our only guide. They stretched out before us, disappearing into the inky blackness. We walked for what felt like hours, the silence broken only by the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional hoot of an owl. No blood, no body, nothing. Just the tracks and the overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air. Maybe it was nothing, Albert said, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. We were just about to turn back, figuring we were chasing shadows, when I saw it. A flicker of blue light, way off in the distance. It was down in the valley, kind of pulsing in and out of sight like someone was messing with a switch. Whoa, did you see that? I whispered to Albert, nudging him with my elbow. He squinted, his eyes scanning the darkness. See what? You're seeing things, man. No, I swear, a blue light. Down there. I pointed towards the valley. He finally spotted it. Ha. Weird. Could be a flashlight. My mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. What if it's the killer, luring someone down there? Albert let out a nervous laugh. Don't be ridiculous. It's probably just some kids messing around. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew that Scream hadn't been kids messing around. Curiosity got the better of us. We had to know what was going on down there. With a shared glance, we veered off the tracks, heading towards the flickering blue light. Getting down to the valley was way harder than we thought. The slope was steep, covered in loose rocks and tangled vines. Every time I slipped, I'd grab onto Albert, my heart pounding like a drum. Dude, be careful, he'd hiss, trying to steady himself. The moon was our only source of light, casting long, creepy shadows that danced around us. I kept imagining things lurking just beyond my vision, shadowy figures, glowing eyes. My mind was playing tricks on me. The smell of damp earth grew stronger, mixed with something else, something rotten. It made my stomach churn. We pushed through bushes, the branches scratching our faces and arms. I could hear the rustle of small animals scurrying away from us, their tiny eyes probably watching us from the darkness. "This is insane," I muttered, my voice shaking. "Almost there," Albert said, pointing to a faint glow ahead. The blue light was getting brighter now, pulsing with an eerie rhythm. It felt like it was drawing us in, like moths to a flame. We stumbled into a small clearing, the trees thinning out around us. And there it was, the source of the blue light. We stumbled out of the thick brush and into a small clearing. It was like someone had punched a hole in the forest. The trees were all gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And right in the middle of it all was this old, run-down shack. The blue light was coming from inside, spilling out through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. It was brighter now, pulsing like a heartbeat. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else. Something almost sweet, but with an undercurrent of decay. "What the hell is this place?" Albert whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, feeling a shiver crawl down my spine. "I don't know, man. But it doesn't feel right." We crept closer, our footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The silence was unnerving. No crickets, no owls, just the sound of our own breathing and the thumping of my heart in my ears. As we got closer to the shack, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of life around it. No animal tracks, no birdsong, nothing. It was like a dead zone. "Maybe we should just go," I said, my voice tight with fear. But Albert was already pushing open the creaking door. "Come on, let's just take a quick look." I hesitated for a moment, then followed him inside. The inside of the shack was even worse than I imagined. It was like stepping into a nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and dust motes danced in the faint blue light that pulsed from somewhere deeper inside. The walls were covered in these weird symbols and drawings. They looked like they were done in charcoal or something, all jagged lines and twisted figures. I couldn't make any sense of them, but they made my skin crawl. It was like the whole place was radiating bad vibes. "What the?" Albert trailed off, his voice full of disbelief. I shone my flashlight around, trying to take it all in. There was a rickety table in the middle of the room, covered in what looked like dried blood. A couple of rusty tools were scattered on the floor, and in the corner, I saw a pile of something. I didn't want to get close enough to find out what it was. The blue light was coming from an old, wooden crate in the far corner. It was pulsing rhythmically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I felt a sense of dread creeping up my spine, like something was watching us. This is seriously messed up, I whispered, my voice trembling. Albert, ever the curious one, was already moving towards the crate. Let's see what's making that light. I wanted to tell him to stop, that we should just get out of there. But something held me back. Curiosity, maybe. Or maybe just plain morbid fascination. He reached the crate and slowly lifted the lid. The blue light intensified, and I swear I heard a low growl coming from the shadows. The blue light was blinding now, pouring out of the crate. Albert shielded his eyes, and I could see the shock on his face. I don't know what he expected to find in there, but it sure as hell wasn't what was glowing inside. It was some kind of crystal, I guess. A jagged, pulsing thing that emitted this unnatural blue light. It was like staring into a tiny sun, and it made my head spin. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling. The second the crate was open, the whole atmosphere in the shack changed. The air grew heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The temperature dropped, and I swear I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was like we weren't alone anymore. Dude, put it back, I whispered, my voice barely a croak. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see. Albert hesitated, his hand hovering over the crate. He was captivated by the crystal, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. I just want to take a closer look, he mumbled, reaching out towards the pulsing light. No! I hissed, grabbing his arm. Don't touch it. But it was too late. The second his fingers brushed against the crystal, a wave of cold air washed over us. The blue light flared, and the shadows in the shack seemed to deepen, swirling around us like living things. And then I heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the darkest corner of the room. Something was in there with us. Something that didn't want us to leave. The growl seemed to reverberate through the shack, shaking the very foundations. The blue light from the crystal pulsed faster, casting frantic shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. And then I saw it. Emerging from the deepest shadows, a figure began to take shape. It was tall and gaunt, almost skeletal, with long limbs that ended in what looked like claws. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were burning with an eerie blue light, just like the crystal. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. This wasn't some campfire story come to life. This was real. This was happening. Albert stumbled back, his face contorted in terror. He tripped over something on the floor and fell, his eyes fixed on the creature. What is that? He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was stare in horror as the creature took a step towards us, its clawed hand reaching out. It moved with an unnatural grace, its eyes burning into us like lasers. This thing, whatever it wasn't human. It was something else. Something ancient and evil. And it was about to get us. Adrenaline surged through me. I grabbed Albert's arm and yanked him up. "Run!" I screamed. We scrambled away from the creature, our feet slipping on the uneven floorboards. I crashed into the table, sending tools clattering to the ground, but I didn't stop. We had to get out of there. The creature lunged, its claws scraping against the wood. I could hear its ragged breathing behind us, close, too close. We burst through the shack door, back into the clearing. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but there was no time to catch my breath. We scrambled through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces, thorns tearing at our clothes. I could hear Albert crashing through the bushes behind me, his panic gasps echoing in the darkness. The creature was right on our heels. I could hear its heavy footsteps pounding the earth, getting closer with every stride. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my blood ran cold. It was gaining on us, its eyes glowing like burning coals in the darkness. "Faster!" I yelled, my voice raw with fear. We stumbled and slid down the steep slope, our feet slipping on loose rocks and damp leaves. I could feel the creature's presence behind me, its hot breath on my neck. We were running for our lives, but it was faster, stronger. I didn't know how much longer we could keep this up. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming for rest. But I couldn't stop. If we stopped, we were dead. We burst out of the trees, tumbling onto the train tracks. I gasped for air, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. Albert collapsed beside me, his chest heaving. We made it," he wheezed, his voice hoarse. I looked back at the valley, half expecting to see the creature emerge from the trees, its eyes burning with that eerie blue light. But there was nothing. Just the dark silhouette of the woods and the faint glow of the moon overhead. We scrambled to our feet, our bodies aching, our clothes torn and covered in dirt. We didn't speak, just ran. We ran along the train tracks, the gravel crunching under our feet, the wind whipping through our hair. We ran until the valley was just a distant memory, until the fear started to subside, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Finally, we collapsed again, this time on the side of the tracks, our bodies spent. We lay there for a long time, just catching our breath, listening to the sound of our own ragged breathing and the pounding of our hearts. "What the hell was that thing?" Albert finally asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to answer. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for sure. We were lucky to be alive. We slowly made our way back to the campsite, our minds reeling from the night's events. The campfire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow on our tent. We crawled inside, too exhausted to even speak. As I lay there, staring up at the canvas ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That something was out there, watching us, waiting. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that we would never forget the horror we had witnessed in the valley. It's been a few weeks since that night, and let me tell you, things haven't exactly gone back to normal. Every time I close my eyes, I see that thing. Its pale skin, those glowing blue eyes, the way it moved, like a predator stalking its prey. Sleep. Yeah, that's pretty much a thing of the past. I keep having nightmares, replaying the whole thing over and over in my head. The screams, the chase, the feeling of its breath on my neck, it's all still so vivid. Albert's not doing much better. He's jumpy, easily startled. We don't talk about what happened much, but I know it's weighing on him just as much as it is on me. We went back to the tracks the next day, half hoping to find some kind of explanation, some evidence that we hadn't just imagined the whole thing. But there was nothing there. No sign of the shack, no blue light, no creature. It was like it had vanished into thin air. The cops, of course, didn't believe us. We tried to report it, but they just looked at us like we were crazy. Kids messing around, they said. Too much time in the woods, they said. Yeah, right. Like we made the whole thing up. But we know what we saw. We know what we experienced. And we know that something is out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victims. So, if you're ever out camping, and you hear a scream in the night, don't go investigating. Just pack up your stuff and get the hell out of there. Trust me, some things are better left undisturbed. I've always considered myself a pretty experienced hiker. I've done a bunch of trails before, mostly short ones, but I've been prepping for this Appalachian Trail through hike for months. Got all the fancy gear, lightweight tent, bear canister, the works. Even practiced hanging my food bag properly, to keep those pesky critters away. Started out at Springer Mountain in Georgia, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. First couple of days were a breeze, weather was perfect, trail was well-maintained, and I was feeling like a total badass. The kind of cocky confidence you get when you're surrounded by nature, thinking you've got it all figured out. But then things started to get a little weird. The deeper I got into the woods, the more isolated I felt. The sounds seemed to amplify, every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, like someone was watching me. I kept seeing shadows flitting at the edge of my vision, but whenever I turned, there was nothing there. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just my imagination, the solitude getting to me. But the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being followed. I started checking over my shoulder constantly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. One evening, I set up camp near this stream, beautiful spot, really. Sun setting through the trees, water babbling over the rocks. But as darkness fell, the woods came alive. The usual night sounds, crickets chirping, owls hooting, were joined by something else, a low guttural growl that seemed to echo through the trees. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. grabbed my bear spray, just in case. The growling continued, intermittent, but definitely getting closer. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sleep was impossible. I lay there in my tent, every nerve on high alert, the growling echoing in my ears. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, closer this time, right outside my tent. I held my breath, fear gripping me like a vice. Then, a sound that chilled me to the bone, the distinct sound of heavy paws padding around my tent. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was curious. I scrambled out of the tent, bear spray clutched in my trembling hand. My headlamp beam danced across the trees, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The growling had stopped, leaving an eerie silence hanging in the air. I felt a surge of adrenaline, that fight or flight response kicking in. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I knew I had to get out of there, find a safer spot, maybe climb a tree or something. But as I turned to run, the beam of my headlamp caught something in the shadows. Two eyes, glowing like embers, staring right at me. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, sending shivers down my spine. It was a bear. A huge black bear, standing just a few feet away. Its massive form seemed to blend into the night, its fur matted and thick. I could see its breath misting in the cool air, its nostrils twitching as it caught my scent. Fear paralyzed me. I stood there, frozen, unable to move or even breathe. The bear took a step closer, its eyes fixed on me. I could see its powerful muscles rippling beneath its thick fur, its claws glinting in the dim light. I raised the bear spray, my finger trembling on the trigger. But I hesitated. I'd heard stories about bears becoming even more aggressive if you sprayed them. And what if I missed? I'd be completely defenseless. The bear took another step, and I knew I had to do something. I squeezed the trigger, sending a cloud of red pepper spray into the air. The bear roared, startled by the sudden assault. It stumbled back, shaking its head and pawing at its eyes. I used the opportunity to run. I didn't look back, just sprinted through the trees, branches whipping in my face, my lungs burning. I could hear the bear crashing through the undergrowth behind me, its enraged roars echoing through the forest. I stumbled and fell, scrambling to my feet again. My ankle twisted beneath me, sending a sharp pain shooting up my leg. I ignored it, adrenaline masking the pain. I had to keep going, had to get away. But the bear was gaining on me. I could hear its heavy breathing, its paws pounding the ground. I glanced over my shoulder and saw its massive form closing in, its eyes burning with rage. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I was trapped, cornered like a rat in a maze. Desperation clawed at me, the primal fear of being hunted, of becoming prey. I spotted a large rock outcropping, a narrow crevice hidden behind it. It was my only chance. I scrambled towards it, my injured ankle throbbing with every step. I squeezed into the crevice, my body scraping against the rough rock. I curled into a ball, my heart pounding like a drum. The bear was right behind me, its hot breath on my neck. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't find me. The bear sniffed the air, its claws scraping against the rock. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. I lay there, curled into a fetal position, my body shaking uncontrollably. I could hear the bear's heavy breathing just outside the crevice, its hot breath washing over me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds, the smells, the terror that threatened to consume me. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The bear paced back and forth, its claws scraping against the rock. I could feel the vibrations through my body, each movement sending a fresh wave of fear through me. I tried to slow my breathing, to calm my racing heart. But it was no use. I was trapped, cornered, with no escape. The bear could reach me at any moment, its powerful jaws capable of crushing my bones. I thought of my family, my friends, all the people I loved. I thought of all the things I still wanted to do, the places I wanted to see. I wasn't ready to die, not like this. But there was nothing I could do. I was helpless, at the mercy of a wild animal. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Suddenly, the bear let out a frustrated growl. It paced back and forth for a few more moments, then I heard it lumbering away. I held my breath, not daring to believe it was truly gone. After a few minutes of silence, I cautiously opened my eyes. The bear was gone. I slowly uncurled myself, my body stiff and sore. I crawled out of the crevice, my injured ankle throbbing with pain. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The forest was dark and silent, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves. I was alone. I limped back to my campsite, my mind reeling from the encounter. I gathered my things, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely pack my backpack. I didn't bother setting up my tent again. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. I started walking, my injured ankle slowing me down, but I didn't care. I just wanted to reach safety. I walked for hours, the forest stretching out before me like an endless maze. The sun began to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. I was exhausted, hungry, and in pain, but I kept going. Finally, I stumbled upon a trail marker. I recognized it from my map. I was close to a road to civilization. Relief washed over me, so intense that I almost collapsed. I limped towards the road, my heart pounding with anticipation. I could hear the sound of cars in the distance, a welcome sign of human presence. As I emerged from the trees, I saw a car approaching. I waved my arms, shouting for help. The car screeched to a halt, and a middle-aged couple jumped out. They looked at me in alarm, their eyes widening at the sight of my torn clothes and bloodied face. I explained what had happened, my voice trembling with emotion. They helped me into their car, their faces filled with concern. They offered me water and snacks and wrapped my injured ankle in a bandage. I sat in the back seat, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. I had survived. I had escaped the bear. But the encounter had left its mark on me. I would never forget the terror, the feeling of helplessness, the knowledge that I had been so close to death. I had learned a valuable lesson that day, a lesson about the power of nature, the fragility of life, and the importance of respecting wild animals. The couple, bless their hearts, were incredibly kind. They called the park rangers and waited with me until help arrived. The rangers checked me out, bandaged my ankle properly, and called for an ambulance to take me to the nearest hospital. Turns out, I had a sprained ankle and a few scratches, but nothing broken. I was lucky, they said. Could have been much worse. They told me about a woman who had been hiking alone a few weeks back and got mauled pretty badly by a bear. She barely made it out alive. Hearing that sent chills down my spine. I realized just how close I had come to being another statistic. I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, those claws, the feeling of utter helplessness. The hospital staff was great, patched me up, and sent me on my way with some crutches and pain meds. I called my brother to come pick me up, feeling too shaken to even think about getting back on the trail. The whole drive back home, I kept replaying the encounter in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bear's face, heard its growls. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was safe in the car. Back in my own apartment, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. I was grateful to be alive, but I also felt this lingering fear, like the bear was still out there, waiting for me. I couldn't sleep, every creak in the building sending me into a panic. I tried to distract myself, watching TV, reading, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the images kept flashing back, the fear gripping me again and again. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, of being chased through the woods, the bear's hot breath on my neck. I knew I needed help. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, afraid of my own shadow. I started seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in trauma. She helped me process the experience, to understand my fear and learn how to cope with it. It's been a few months now, and I'm doing better. The nightmares are less frequent, the anxiety less intense. But the experience has changed me. I'm not the same carefree hiker I was before. I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I know that nature is beautiful, but it's also powerful and unpredictable. I still love hiking, but I'll never forget the lessons I learned on that fateful trip. I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted, the terror of facing a wild animal, the realization that I was just another creature in the food chain. Therapy helped, it really did. Talking about the experience, dissecting it with someone who understood trauma, it started to make some sense of the chaos in my head. But there were still things I couldn't shake. Like the hypervigilance. I was constantly on edge, scanning my surroundings for any sign of danger. Crossing the street, I'd flinch at every shadow, every sudden movement. Even in my own apartment, I'd find myself jumping at the slightest noise, my heart pounding like a drum. Sleeping was still a battle. The nightmares weren't as frequent, but they were more intense, more vivid. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the feeling of the bear's hot breath on my neck lingering long after the dream had faded. And then there were the flashbacks. They'd come out of nowhere, triggered by the most random things. The smell of pine needles, the sound of a twig snapping, even a glimpse of a black dog in the park could send me spiraling back to that moment, trapped in the crevice, waiting for the bear to strike. It affected my relationships too. I found myself withdrawing from friends and family, not wanting to talk about what had happened. I felt like they wouldn't understand, that they'd think I was weak or crazy. I started avoiding things I used to enjoy. Hiking, of course, was out of the question. But even just being in nature, surrounded by trees, made me anxious. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows. I felt like I was losing myself, becoming a prisoner of my own fear. The confident, adventurous woman I used to be was gone, replaced by someone timid and scared. But I knew I couldn't give up. I had to find a way to move on, to reclaim my life. I started pushing myself, little by little. I'd go for walks in the park, forcing myself to face my fear of the outdoors. I'd talk to friends and family, sharing my experience and allowing myself to be vulnerable. It was a slow process, with setbacks and challenges along the way. But gradually, I started to heal. The flashbacks became less frequent, the nightmares less intense. I started to feel like myself again, albeit a slightly different version, one with scars, both physical and emotional. I realized that the encounter with the bear had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. It had taught me resilience, the strength to face my fears and overcome adversity. It had also given me a newfound appreciation for life, for the preciousness of each moment. I knew I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew that I wouldn't let it define me. I would keep moving forward, embracing life with all its challenges and uncertainties. And I would always remember the lessons I learned on that fateful day on the Appalachian Trail. It was a crisp autumn day when I finally felt ready to face my fears. The leaves were turning vibrant shades of red and gold, and the air was filled with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. I decided to go for a hike, not on the Appalachian Trail, of course, but on a small, well-maintained trail in a local park. I was nervous, I won't lie. My heart pounded as I stepped onto the trail, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sent a jolt of anxiety through me. But I kept going, reminding myself that I was safe, that this was a different place, a different time. I focused on the beauty around me, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the birds singing in the branches. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the fresh air, trying to calm my nerves. As I walked, I thought about everything that had happened. The encounter with the bear, the fear, the trauma, but I also thought about how far I had come, how much I had overcome. I realized that the experience had changed me, but it hadn't broken me. It had made me stronger, more resilient. It had taught me to appreciate the fragility of life, the importance of living in the present moment. I reached a clearing and sat down on a fallen log, closing my eyes and listening to the sounds of the forest. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. Suddenly, I heard a noise. A twig snapping, close by. My eyes flew open, my heart pounding. I scanned the trees, searching for the source of the sound. And then I saw it. A squirrel, scampering up a tree trunk. I let out a shaky breath, realizing how silly I had been. It was just a squirrel, not a bear. I smiled to myself, feeling a sense of triumph. I had faced my fear, and I had come out the other side. I was still scared, but I was also stronger. I finished my hike, feeling a sense of accomplishment. I had taken a step towards healing, towards reclaiming my life. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, but I also knew that I could handle them. I started going on more hikes, gradually increasing the difficulty and remoteness of the trails. Each time, I felt a little bit braver, a little bit more confident. I was still cautious, but I wasn't letting fear control me anymore. I even started thinking about going back to the Appalachian Trail one day. Not to complete the through hike, not yet. But maybe to do a short section, to face my demons and prove to myself that I could overcome them. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to do it. I had come too far to let fear hold me back. I was a survivor, and I was going to live my life to the fullest. It was a humid summer morning when I set out on the trail, a familiar sense of excitement mixed with a lingering apprehension. This time, I chose a more challenging route, one that wound through dense forest and climbed steep hills. I wanted to push myself, to prove that I was no longer afraid. The early part of the hike was uneventful. The sun filtered through the canopy of leaves, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Birds chirped merrily, and the air was filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I felt a sense of calm, of being at one with nature. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavy and still, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense of being watched. I scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the dense undergrowth and the towering trees. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, a residual effect of my past trauma. But the feeling persisted. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the summit and the open views it promised. As I climbed higher, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I stumbled upon a clearing, a small patch of sunlight breaking through the dense canopy. In the center of the clearing stood a lone tree, its trunk scarred and twisted. As I approached, I noticed something strange. There were deep gouges in the bark of the tree, as if something had clawed at it with immense force. I knelt down, examining the marks closely. They were fresh, the sap still oozing from the wounds. My heart pounded in my chest. I thought of the bear, its powerful claws, the way it had torn at the rock crevice where I had hidden. A wave of fear washed over me, threatening to overwhelm me. I stood up abruptly, my senses on high alert. I scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the eerie silence of the forest. I continued my hike, my pace quickening with every step. I wanted to reach the summit, to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the woods. But the image of the scarred tree lingered in my mind, a reminder of the power of nature, the ever-present danger that lurked in the shadows. I finally reached the summit, the wind whipping in my face, the view stretching out before me in a panorama of rolling hills and valleys. But the sense of accomplishment was overshadowed by a gnawing unease. The scarred tree, the oppressive silence of the forest, the feeling of being watched, it all weighed heavily on my mind. I decided to head back down, my pace quicker than before. The sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. The forest seemed to darken, the trees taking on an ominous silhouette against the fading light. As I descended, the feeling of being watched intensified. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. I tried to rationalize my fear, telling myself it was just nerves, a leftover from my past trauma. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The forest felt different, charged with an unsettling energy. The light was fading fast now, the shadows deepening. I fumbled for my headlamp, my hands shaking as I switched it on. The narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trail ahead. But it also revealed something else. Just off the trail, partially hidden in the undergrowth, lay a pile of something. I couldn't quite make it out in the dim light, but it looked like bones. Animal bones, scattered and gnawed clean. My stomach churned. I thought of the bear again, its powerful jaws, the way it had torn at the rock crevice. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. I hurried past the gruesome sight, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to get out of the woods, back to the safety of my car. But the trail seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness closing in around me. Then I heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural, echoing through the trees. It was the same sound I had heard that night in my tent, the sound that had haunted my nightmares. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. Panic seized me. I started running, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly, the trail blurring before my eyes. I could hear the footsteps behind me, gaining ground. I stumbled and fell, my ankle twisting beneath me. I cried out in pain, scrambling to my feet again. But it was too late. The creature emerged from the trees, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was bigger than I remembered, more menacing. And it was heading straight for me. My name's Jack, and I'm what you might call a fishing fanatic. Seriously, the moment I have a free day, I'm itching to get out there and cast a line. There's just something about it, you know? The peace and quiet, being alone with your thoughts, not having to worry about anything except waiting for a tug on the line and then the thrill of reeling it in, wondering how big it'll be. This Saturday was no different. I was up before the crack of dawn, practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. Couldn't sleep a wink last night. I was so psyched for this trip. Had all my gear ready to go, my trusty tackle box overflowing with lures, a thermos full of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and a couple of PB&J sandwiches. Simple, but they do the trick. Time to hit the lake. The trail leading to my favorite spot was pretty overgrown, almost hidden by the trees and bushes crowding in on both sides. Dew clung to everything, soaking my jeans as I walked. But hey, the air was crisp and clean, with that earthy smell you only get in the woods. This lake isn't some fancy resort or anything. It's tucked away in the woods behind my house, a small, secluded spot surrounded by tall pines and the occasional gnarled oak. You can hear the leaves rustling in the breeze and the birds chirping their morning songs. I've been coming here since I was a kid, practically grew up on these shores. It's my escape, my sanctuary, the place where I can truly be myself, away from all the noise and expectations of everyday life. I reached my usual spot, a small clearing right on the edge of the lake. Perfect spot for casting, with plenty of room to back up if I hooked a real whopper. The sun was just starting to break through the trees, casting long shadows across the water. It was so peaceful, so still. I almost dozed off for a second there, just soaking it all in. But then, something caught my eye. Movement. On the other side of the lake, near a cluster of fallen logs. At first, I thought it was a deer, maybe coming down for a morning drink. But then it moved again, and I saw it. A mountain lion, just sitting there on a log, staring right at me. This thing was huge. I mean, I'd seen pictures of mountain lions before, but seeing one in person is a whole different story. It was all muscle and sinew, with a coat the color of dried leaves. Its eyes were fixed on me, these intense yellow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. And the weirdest thing? It didn't seem scared of me at all. No nervous twitching, no cautious slinking away. Just observing. Like I was the one intruding on its territory. Which, I guess, I was. But still, it was freaking me out. I mean, this is a predator, a wild animal. Shouldn't it be more afraid of a human? My heart started pounding in my chest, and I could feel the adrenaline starting to pump. This was definitely not how I expected my relaxing fishing trip to start. I couldn't take my eyes off that mountain lion. It was like some kind of morbid fascination, you know? The way it just sat there, so still, so confident. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it's just curious, I thought. Maybe it's never seen a human before. Yeah, right. Like this was some remote mountaintop and not a lake a short walk from my backyard. But still, a tiny part of me clung to that hope. Maybe if I just stayed calm, didn't make any sudden moves, it would eventually lose interest and wander off. Fat chance. After what felt like an eternity, the mountain lion finally shifted its position. It stood up, stretching its long, lean body. I swear, I could practically hear its muscles rippling beneath its fur. Then, it stepped off the log and onto the forest floor. It moved with this incredible grace, almost like it was gliding. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out of there. But my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then it started walking. Not away from me, like I'd hoped. No, it started walking towards me. Slowly, deliberately, with its eyes locked on mine. Each step it took sent a jolt of terror through me. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was something else. This was hunting. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Common sense screamed at me to run, but something deep down told me that was the worst possible move. I'd seen enough nature documentaries to know that running would trigger its predatory instincts. This thing was already hunting me. I didn't want to make myself look like an even easier target. I decided to try and make myself look bigger, more intimidating. I raised my arms above my head, trying to mimic the size of a bear or something. I even let out a yell, this pathetic attempt at a roar that probably sounded more like a scared kitten. Yeah, real intimidating, Jack. The mountain lion didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, closing the distance between us with those slow, deliberate steps. I glanced around frantically, looking for anything that could help me. A rock, a stick, anything to defend myself with. But there was nothing. Just me, the mountain lion, and the growing sense of dread that was starting to consume me. I was trapped, cornered like a rat. This was it, wasn't it? This was how it all ended. Alone in the woods, mauled by a mountain lion. What a way to go. But then, a crazy idea popped into my head. The lake. Maybe I could make it to the lake, jump in, and swim away. Mountain lions aren't exactly known for their swimming skills, are they? It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and ran. Adrenaline surged through me, blurring my vision as I sprinted towards the lake. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. The mountain lion was right behind me. I could hear its paws pounding the earth, getting closer with every stride. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw it, a blur of tawny fur and muscle, gaining on me fast. Its eyes were locked on me, filled with a predatory hunger that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled over a tree root, nearly falling headfirst into the dirt. Panic welled up inside me, threatening to overwhelm me. "Come on, Jack, get up!" I screamed at myself, scrambling back to my feet. The lake was just ahead, shimmering through the trees. So close, yet so far. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain, the exhaustion, the fear that threatened to consume me. With a final burst of energy, I burst through the trees and onto the shore. The cool water beckoned, promising escape. Without hesitation, I plunged in, the icy shock momentarily taking my breath away. I kicked furiously, swimming with all my might, putting as much distance between myself and that creature as possible. But even as I swam, a chilling realization dawned on me. I couldn't stay in the water forever. Eventually, I would have to go back to shore. And when I did, it would be waiting. The icy water stole my breath, each gasp a struggle. But I forced myself to keep going, to put as much distance between myself and the shore as possible. I didn't look back, didn't dare. I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my back, even from across the lake. My arms started to ache, my strokes becoming weaker. Panic gnawed at me. How long could I keep this up? I wasn't exactly an Olympic swimmer. Just then, my hand brushed against something solid. Relief washed over me. An island. Small, just a clump of trees and rocks really, but it was something. I pulled myself onto the rocky shore, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and cold. I collapsed onto the ground, my wet clothes clinging to me like a second skin. The island was tiny, barely bigger than my living room. But at least it was solid ground. At least for now, I was safe. The mountain lion couldn't reach me here. I looked back at the shore, scanning the treeline. Nothing. No sign of the creature. Had it given up? Had it lost interest? Or was it simply biding its time, waiting for me to make my next move? I didn't know. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, a flicker of hope ignited within me. Maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. I huddled on that tiny island, shivering in my soaked clothes. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the lake. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. I scanned the shoreline again, my eyes straining to pierce the gathering darkness. Still nothing. Maybe I was in the clear. Maybe the mountain lion had moved on. A wave of exhaustion washed over me. I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and the adrenaline that had kept me going was starting to wear off. My eyelids felt heavy, my body ached. I knew I needed rest, but the thought of closing my eyes, of being vulnerable, terrified me. What if the mountain lion was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down? Just as that thought crossed my mind, I heard it. A low growl, deep and guttural, echoing across the water. My blood ran cold. It was back. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the shoreline frantically, searching for the source of the sound. And then I saw it. Standing on the shore, bathed in the fading light, was the mountain lion. Its eyes, glowing like embers in the dusk, were fixed on me. It had been there all along, watching, waiting. And now it was coming for me. Terror seized me. I was trapped, cornered on this pathetic excuse for an island, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The mountain lion stepped into the water, its powerful limbs propelling it forward. The water barely reached its chest. It was like something out of a nightmare, this creature stalking towards me, its eyes burning with predatory intent. My mind raced, desperately searching for a solution, any way out of this impossible situation. Could I fight it? No, that was insane. I was no match for a predator like this. Could I swim back to shore? Maybe, but what then? I'd just be running into its jaws. As the mountain lion drew closer, a surge of defiance coursed through me. I wouldn't go down without a fight. I grabbed a fist-sized rock from the ground, my knuckles turning white as I gripped it tightly. "Come on, you overgrown house cat," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear and adrenaline. "I'm not afraid of you." The mountain lion paused, its head cocked to one side, as if considering my challenge. Then, with a snarl that sent shivers down my spine, it lunged. I braced myself for the impact, raising the rock in a desperate attempt to defend myself. This was it. The moment of truth. Either I fight or I die. The mountain lion's hot breath washed over me as it lunged. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the impact, the sharp claws, the teeth sinking into my flesh. But it never came. Instead, I heard a splash, a startled yell, and then silence. Cautiously, I opened my eyes. The mountain lion was gone. Vanished. I looked around, my heart still pounding in my chest. Where did it go? What happened? Then I saw it. The log. The rotten, decaying log that had been partially submerged in the water. It had given way under the mountain lion's weight, plunging the creature into the depths of the lake. I watched in stunned disbelief as the water churned and bubbled, then finally stilled. The mountain lion was gone, swallowed by the murky depths. I was safe. I had survived. I collapsed onto the ground, my body trembling with relief and exhaustion. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the terror I had just experienced. I looked at the lake, now calm and serene, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that beneath the surface, something dark and dangerous lurked. And I knew that I would never forget this day, the day I stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. It took a while to get back to shore. My legs were shaky, my whole body exhausted, and I had to keep stopping to catch my breath. By the time I reached my truck, it was full dark. The drive home was a blur. I just wanted to get back to my warm house, a hot shower, and my own bed. But things weren't the same. Not after that day. The peace I used to find in those woods, by that lake, was gone. Replaced by a constant unease, a feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger. Every rustle of leaves sent shivers down my spine. I tried to go back to my normal life. I went to work, I ate my meals, I even tried watching some TV. But it was no use. The image of that mountain lion, its eyes burning into me, haunted my every waking moment. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, heard its growl. I started having nightmares. Vivid, terrifying nightmares where I was back on the island, the mountain lion stalking towards me, its claws outstretched. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the sheets twisted around me. It took a long time, months even, before I finally started to feel normal again. The nightmares became less frequent, the fear less intense. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that something changed that day. Something inside me. I'm not the same carefree guy who used to spend his weekends fishing by the lake. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the dangers lurking in the shadows. And I know, deep down, that I'll never truly escape the memory of that encounter, the day I came face to face with a predator and lived to tell the tale. Damn, it's hot. I muttered to myself, wiping a bead of sweat off my brow. Guess that's what I get for signing up to be a park ranger in the middle of the freaking Sonoran Desert. My name's Jake, and I've been baking in this desolate expanse for the better part of 15 years. In that time, I've come to know every inch of these dusty roads, every twist and turn of these canyons. Came here to escape the city, the noise, the crowds. Figured the desert would be quiet. Turns out, it whispers. And sometimes, those whispers scream. The call came in just after noon, crackling through the static on my ancient truck radio. It was Mike, one of our maintenance guys, his voice tight with a tremor I'd never heard from him before. Ranger station, got something strange out here. Near the old mine shafts, off the main trail. What is it, Mike? You all right? I asked, already reaching for the map tucked under my seat. My gut clenched with a familiar unease. Whenever someone called in a strange occurrence in this part of the world, it usually meant trouble. Found a car, looks like it's been burnt to a crisp. Ain't never seen anything like it. He paused, and I could practically hear him swallow hard over the radio. There's someone inside. My stomach tightened. Stay put, Mike. And Mike, whatever you do, don't touch anything. I'm on my way. I grabbed my hat and water bottle, the unease settling in my gut like a lead weight. The old mine shafts were in one of the most isolated sections of the park, a place we rarely patrolled. It was a sweltering, God-forsaken corner of the desert, miles from any real civilization. The thought of something going wrong out there, with no backup for miles, sent a shiver down my spine even though the temperature was pushing triple digits. As I navigated the bone-jarring tracks towards the mine shafts, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a routine call. There was a darkness in Mike's voice, a raw fear that resonated through the crackling radio waves and settled deep within me. Whatever he found out there, it was bad. Real bad. The drive felt longer than usual. Every bump in the road, every rustle of wind through the dry brush, seemed to amplify the tension coiling in my gut. The sun beat down with relentless fury, turning the desert into a shimmering oven. By the time I reached the turnoff for the old mine shafts, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my mouth felt like sandpaper. I wrestled the truck down the narrow, barely there track that led to the site. The mines themselves were long abandoned, a relic of a bygone era when men chased dreams of gold and silver in these unforgiving hills. Now, they were nothing more than crumbling shafts and rusting machinery, a testament to human greed and the desert's indifference. As I rounded a bend, I saw it. Mike's maintenance truck was parked haphazardly off to the side, and a plume of smoke still curled lazily from the wreckage that had been a car. The smell hit me first, a sickening blend of burnt metal, rubber, and something else, something acrid and deeply unsettling. I pulled up next to Mike, who was leaning against his truck, looking pale and shaken. He took one look at me and let out a shaky breath. "Glad you're here, Jake. This is messed up." I nodded, trying to maintain a calm I didn't feel. "Show me." We approached the car cautiously. It was a charred skeleton, the windows blown out, the paint blistered and peeling. The interior was a blackened mess, the seats reduced to ash. And in the driver's seat, I swallowed hard, the bile rising in my throat. There was a body, or what was left of one. It was slumped over the steering wheel, limbs contorted at unnatural angles. The flesh was blackened and charred, the smell making my stomach churn. But the worst part was the face, or what remained of it. It was a melted mask of agony, frozen in a silent scream. "Jesus," I whispered, taking a step back. "What the hell happened here?" Mike shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. Found it just like this. Didn't touch nothing, Dot." I forced myself to take a closer look, trying to ignore the nausea rising in my throat. There were no signs of a struggle, no tire tracks other than the ones I'd made. Just this horror show in the middle of nowhere. "We need to call the sheriff," I said, my voice hoarse. "This isn't an accident." The sheriff arrived with a deputy about an hour later, a plume of dust trailing their cruiser as they pulled up to the scene. Sheriff Brody, a man who looked like he'd spent his entire life squinting at the desert sun, stepped out, his eyes already scanning the scene with a practiced eye. "Damn, Jake," he muttered, taking in the sight of the burnt-out car and the grim tableau within. "This ain't pretty." "Tell me about it," I said, running a hand through my sweat-dampened hair. "Mike found it a couple of hours ago. Says he hasn't touched a thing." Brody grunted, then crouched down beside the car, peering through the shattered windshield. The deputy, a young guy named Miller who looked fresh out of the academy, circled the car, taking pictures. "Looks like we got ourselves a crispy critter," Brody said, his voice flat. He straightened up, pulling a pair of gloves from his belt. "You get a closer look?" I nodded, pointing towards the driver's seat. "Bodies in there. Can't tell much, though. Burnt pretty bad." Brody pulled on his gloves and cautiously approached the car. He peered inside, then let out a low whistle. "Damn. This ain't no campfire accident." He spent the next few minutes examining the scene, poking around the car and muttering to himself. Miller finished his photos and joined Brody by the car, the two of them exchanging a few hushed words. Finally, Brody straightened up and walked back towards me. "Well, Jake," he said, removing his gloves. "Looks like we got ourselves a suicide." I frowned. "Suicide?" "Sheriff, the guy's practically been cremated." "How can you tell?" Brody sighed, that world-weary sigh of a man who's seen too much. "No signs of a struggle, no other tracks around. And look at the position of the body. Hands still gripping the wheel, like he was driving right into the flames. Happens more than you'd think. Folks get desperate out here." He paused, then added, "Besides, with the way things are these days, with all the cartel activity around here, probably some drug runner who got cornered. Figured this was a better way to go than what they had planned for him." I wasn't convinced, but I knew better than to argue with Brody. He'd seen more death and despair in this desert than I could ever imagine. Still, something about the scene felt off. The sheer brutality of it, the way the body was almost posed. It just didn't sit right. "All right, Sheriff," I said. "What happens now?" "We'll get the body out, have the forensics boys take a look. Car gets towed, case gets filed. Same old song and dance." He clapped me on the shoulder. "You did good, Jake. Reporting this. Now, why don't you head back to the station and get yourself some iced tea? You look like you could use it." I nodded, but as I turned to leave, I couldn't help but take one last look at the charred remains of the car. The desert wind whipped around me, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. And in those whispers, I thought I heard something else. A faint, chilling laughter that seemed to echo from the depths of the burning car. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur. The image of that charred body, the twisted metal of the car, the smell, it all swirled in my head, a gruesome kaleidoscope I couldn't shut out. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to make sense of it, searching for some detail, some clue that might explain what happened. But there was nothing. just a void of unanswered questions and a growing sense of unease. Back at the station, I tried to distract myself with paperwork, but the words swam before my eyes. The usually comforting routine of logging reports and checking inventory felt meaningless in the face of the horror I'd witnessed. Even the familiar creak of the ceiling fan and the chirping of crickets outside the window seemed to mock my attempts at normalcy. I finally gave up on work and headed to the break room for a cup of coffee, hoping the caffeine would jolt me out of my funk. As I poured myself a cup, I noticed a newspaper someone had left on the table. The headline screamed about another drug bust near the border, the latest in a string of violent incidents linked to the cartels. Brody's words echoed in my mind, probably some drug runner who got cornered. I sank into a chair, the newspaper clutched in my hand. Was that all it was? Another casualty in the endless drug war, another life extinguished in the unforgiving desert? It was easy to dismiss it that way, to file it away as just another statistic. But something deep down told me there was more to the story. There was a darkness in that burned-out car, a malice that went beyond the violence of the cartels. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, the image of the charred body haunting my every thought. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, I found myself drawn to the window, staring out at the vast expanse of sand and scrub. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. It was a silence that held secrets, a silence that whispered of things unseen and unknown. And in that silence, I felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that this was just the beginning. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, a grotesque mask of pain seared into my memory. The desert night was usually a symphony of sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the distant howl of a coyote. But tonight, it was all I could do to block out the echoes of that chilling laughter I'd heard at the scene. I tossed and turned, the sheets tangled around my legs. My mind raced, replaying the events of the day, analyzing every detail, searching for an explanation that made sense. But the more I thought about it, the more disturbed I became. The sheriff's explanation, all plausible, felt too easy, too convenient. There was something about the scene that just didn't add up. The position of the body, for instance. Brody had said the victim's hands were still gripping the wheel, as if he'd driven straight into the flames. But I remembered seeing the body slumped over, the arms contorted at unnatural angles. It was as if someone had placed him there after the fact. And then there was the smell. It wasn't just the smell of burnt flesh and metal. There was another scent, something underlying it all, something acrid and unfamiliar. I couldn't place it, but it lingered in my nostrils, a phantom smell that refused to dissipate. I finally gave up on sleep and stumbled out of bed. The clock on the nightstand read 3 a.m. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, hoping to cool down the burning in my throat. As I drank, I stared out the window at the desert night. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The shadows seemed to dance and writhe, taking on the shapes of monstrous creatures. I shivered, pulling my robe tighter around me. The desert had always been a place of solitude and peace for me. But tonight, it felt different. It felt menacing, as if something dark and malevolent was lurking just beyond my sight. I went back to bed, but sleep remained elusive. I lay there, listening to the silence, my mind filled with dark thoughts and disturbing images. And as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this go. I was going to find out what really happened at those mine shafts, even if it was the last thing I did. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and uneasy days. I went through the motions at work, patrolling the park, responding to calls, but my mind was always elsewhere. The burnt car, the charred body, the unanswered questions, they haunted me like a persistent ghost. I found myself constantly scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of something out of place, anything that might offer a clue to the mystery that had consumed me. One evening, I decided to pay a visit to the local library. I figured maybe some research could shed some light on the situation. The library was a small, dusty building, more of a glorified bookmobile than a proper library, but it had a decent collection of local history books and news archives. I spent hours poring over old newspapers, searching for any reports of similar incidents in the area. There were plenty of stories about drug smuggling, border disputes, and the occasional missing person case, but nothing that matched the gruesome scene I'd witnessed. Just as I was about to give up, I stumbled upon an article tucked away in the back pages of a decades-old newspaper. The headline read, "Mysterious Death in the Desert." The article, dated 1978, described the discovery of a burned-out car near the same mine shafts where I'd found the recent victim. The details were eerily similar. A lone male driver, charred beyond recognition, no apparent cause of death. The article concluded with a quote from the then sheriff, who attributed the incident to foul play but admitted they had no leads. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a one-off incident. Something dark and sinister had been happening in this part of the desert for decades. And now, it seemed, it was happening again. I left the library with a renewed sense of urgency. I had to find out what was going on. I had to stop it before anyone else got hurt. But where do I even begin? The sheriff had dismissed the case as a suicide, and even with this new information, I doubted he'd be willing to reopen the investigation. I was on my own. As I drove back to the ranger station, the desert seemed to close in around me, the silence pressing down like a suffocating blanket. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows across the landscape, and the wind whispered through the dry brush, carrying with it the echoes of the dead. I felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that I was walking into something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a renewed sense of determination. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and I was going to get to the bottom of it, even if it meant going against the sheriff's conclusion. My first stop was the medical examiner's office. I figured if anyone could shed some light on the victim's death, it would be the folks who examined the body. To me, a stern-looking woman named Dr. Ramirez listened patiently as I explained my concerns. She then pulled up the case file on her computer, her brow furrowing as she reviewed the details. "Ranger," she said, leaning back in her chair, "I understand your concern, but the official cause of death was ruled as severe burns and smoke inhalation. There was little left to examine, but the evidence pointed to self-immolation. But what about the position of the body? And the smell?" I pressed. There was something off about it, something that didn't fit with a simple suicide. Dr. Ramirez sighed. "Ranger, I'm a medical examiner, not a detective. My job is to determine the cause of death, not the circumstances surrounding it. If you have suspicions of foul play, you should take them to the sheriff." I knew she was right, but the meeting left me feeling more frustrated than ever. I thanked Dr. Ramirez and headed back to my truck, the desert sun beating down on me with renewed intensity. As I drove, I thought about my options. Going back to the sheriff was a dead end, I knew that. He'd already made up his mind, and no amount of pleading from a park ranger was going to change it. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I was going back to the scene of the crime. Maybe there was something I missed, some clue that everyone else had overlooked. Or maybe, just maybe, I could find something that would convince the sheriff to take another look at the case. With that thought in mind, I turned the truck around and headed back towards the old mine shafts. The desert stretched out before me, a vast and unforgiving landscape that held its secrets close. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move. The wind seemed to whisper warnings in my ear, urging me to turn back, to leave this mystery unsolved. But I pressed on, driven by a force I couldn't explain. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. The familiar dread crept back in as I approached the mine shafts. The place seemed to hold a different kind of silence this time, heavier, expectant. I parked my truck a good distance away, grabbed my flashlight, and made my way towards the site on foot. The wind whipped at my face, carrying with it the scent of dust and something faintly metallic, like dried blood. The blackened patch of ground where the car had been was still there, a scar on the desert floor. I knelt down, scanning the area with my flashlight. The sheriff's guys had done a decent job cleaning up, but I could still make out fragments of glass, bits of charred metal, and, was that a bone fragment? I picked it up gingerly. It was small, blackened, and unmistakably human. A wave of nausea washed over me. I dropped the fragment and stood up abruptly, my heart pounding. This wasn't right. This wasn't just some random suicide. There was something evil here, something lingering. I circled the area, my flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness. The mine shafts loomed in the distance, black mouths gaping in the hillside. A shiver ran down my spine. I had the sudden urge to get out of there, to run back to the truck and never look back. But something kept me rooted to the spot. A need to understand, to confront the darkness that had taken hold of this place. As I neared one of the mine shafts, I noticed something glinting in the fading light. I cautiously approached, my heart in my throat. It was a small, metal object, half buried in the sand. I knelt down and brushed the sand away. It was a lighter, a cheap plastic one with a faded cartoon character on it. I recognized it instantly. It was Mike's. My blood ran cold. Mike had sworn he hadn't touched anything. But his lighter was here, at the scene of the crime. Why would he lie? What was he hiding? Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A faint rustling from inside the mine shaft. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. The rustling grew louder, closer. Something was moving in the darkness. I raised my flashlight, my finger trembling on the switch. The beam danced across the rough walls of the shaft, revealing nothing but shadows. Then I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing red in the darkness. They stared at me, filled with malice and hunger. A scream caught in my throat. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a loose rock. I fell, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering down the shaft. The red eyes followed me, their glow intensifying. Something was coming. Something evil. Adrenaline surged through me. I scrambled back, scrambling for purchase on the loose gravel, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The red eyes advanced, two burning coals in the pitch black, and I could hear the scrape of claws on rock, the heavy panting of something inhuman. Panic clawed at my throat. I had to get out of there. Now! I lurched to my feet, stumbling blindly in the darkness. My hands scraped against the rough walls of the mine shaft, searching for an escape, a way out. But there was nothing. Just the cold, unforgiving rock and the encroaching darkness. The red eyes were closer now, and I could make out the shape of the creature attached to them. It was large, hunched over, with long, spindly limbs that ended in wickedly sharp claws. Its fur was matted and filthy, and its breath came in ragged gasps, a foul stench that filled the air. A guttural growl echoed through the shaft, sending shivers down my spine. The creature lunged, its claws reaching for me. I flinched back, narrowly avoiding its grasp. My back hit the cold rock wall, and I knew I was trapped. There was no time to think, no time to reason. Survival instinct took over. I lashed out, kicking blindly at the creature, my boots connecting with something solid. A yelp of pain echoed through the shaft, and the red eyes retreated slightly. I seized the opportunity. I pushed myself off the wall, scrambling away from the creature, my hands searching for a handhold, a foothold, anything to get me out of that hellish pit. My fingers found a crack in the rock face, and I pulled myself upwards, my muscles screaming in protest. The creature lunged again, its claws grazing my leg, tearing through my pants and drawing blood. I cried out in pain but didn't stop climbing. I had to get out, had to escape the clutches of this monstrous thing. Finally, I reached the edge of the shaft. I hauled myself over the edge, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. I lay there for a moment, my body trembling, my mind reeling from the encounter. Then, slowly, I pushed myself up and looked back at the mine shaft. The red eyes were still there, burning in the darkness. But they were receding, fading into the depths of the earth. The creature was gone, for now. I stumbled back to my truck, my legs shaking, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What was that thing? Where did it come from? And what did it want? I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I had to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. I jumped into the truck and sped off. The image of the red eyes burned into my memory. The desert stretched out before me, a vast and empty landscape that suddenly felt filled with unseen dangers. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The next few weeks were a blur. I barely slept, haunted by nightmares of red eyes and grasping claws. I threw myself into work, taking on extra shifts, anything to keep my mind occupied and off the horrors I'd witnessed. But the desert, once a place of solace, now felt oppressive, filled with unseen dangers lurking just beyond my sight. I tried talking to Brody, telling him about the newspaper article, the lighter, the creature in the mine shaft. He listened patiently, his brow furrowed in concern, but in the end, he just shook his head and patted me on the shoulder. "Jake," he said, "I know you're shaken up, but you gotta let this go. You're seeing things that ain't there. It's the desert playing tricks on you." I knew he didn't believe me, but I couldn't blame him. What I'd seen defied explanation, defied logic. Even I had trouble believing it sometimes. But deep down, I knew it was real. I knew something evil was out there, something that preyed on the vulnerable, something that had been doing this for decades. I started carrying my gun everywhere, even off duty. I checked the locks on my doors and windows obsessively. Every shadow, every creak in the night, sent my heart racing. I was a prisoner in my own home, a prisoner of my own fear. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and drove out to the desert, the familiar road stretching out before me like a lifeline. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a desperate need to escape the confines of my fear. I drove for hours, the engine roaring, the wind whipping through my hair. The desert night was alive with sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals, the distant howl of a coyote. But tonight, the sounds didn't comfort me. They felt like whispers, warnings from the darkness. As I drove, I thought about Mike. He'd been acting strangely ever since the incident, withdrawn, jumpy. I tried talking to him, but he brushed me off, his eyes filled with a fear I couldn't comprehend. Now, I realized, I knew what he was afraid of. He'd seen it too. The creature in the mine shaft. And he knew it wasn't finished. I pulled over to the side of the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I got out of the truck and stood there, staring out at the vast expanse of desert. The silence was deafening, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the distance, a pair of red eyes glowing in the darkness. The creature. It had found me. I reached for my gun, my hand trembling. But I knew it was no use. This was something beyond bullets, beyond human comprehension. This was the darkness of the desert, come to claim its due. The red eyes advanced, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. The last thing I heard was the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the chilling laughter of the creature. And then, darkness.